This is the second part of chapter 38. While Ralph and Sir Mulberry had been conversing together, and long before the conversation was concluded, the omnibus had disgorged Miss Nickleby and Smike, her escort, and they had arrived at her own door. Now, the good nature of the little miniature painter would by no means allow of Smike's walking back again until he had been previously refreshed with just a sip of something comfortable and a mixed biscuit or so, and Smike, entertaining no objection either to the sip of something comfortable or the mixed biscuit, but considering on the contrary that they would be a very pleasant preparation for the walk to Bow, it fell out that he delayed much longer than he had originally intended, and it was some half hour after dusk when he set forth on his journey home. There was no likelihood of his losing his way, for it lay quite straight before him, and he had walked into town with Nicholas and back alone almost every day. So Miss Nickleby and he shook hands, and with mutual confidence, being charged with more kind remembrances to Mrs. Nickleby and Miss Nickleby, Smike started off. At the foot of Ludgate Hill, he turned a little out of the road to satisfy his curiosity for having a look at Newgate Prison. After staring up at the sombre walls from the opposite side of the way with great care and dread for some minutes, he turned back again into the old track and walked briskly through the city, stopping now and then to gaze in at the window of some particularly attractive shop, then running for a little way, then stopping again, and so on, as any other country lad might do. He had been gazing for a long time through a jeweller's window, wishing he could take some of the beautiful trinkets home as a present, and imagining what delight they would afford if he could, when the clocks struck 8:75, and roused by the sound, he hurried out at a very quick pace, and was crossing the corner of a by-street, when he felt himself violently brought to with a jerk so sudden that he was obliged to cling to a lamp-post to save himself from falling, and at the same moment a small boy clung tight around his leg, and a shrill cry was heard. "Here he is, father! Hooray!" vibrated in his ears. Smike knew that voice all too well. He cast his despairing eyes downwards towards the form from which it had proceeded, and shuddering from head to foot looked round. Mr. Squeers had hooked him in the coat collar with the handle of his umbrella, and was hanging on at the other end with all his might and main. The cry of triumph proceeded from Master Wackford, who, regardless of all his kicks and struggles, clung on to him with the tenacity of a bulldog. One glance showed him this, and in that one glance the terrified Smike became utterly powerless and unable to utter a sound. "Here's a go!" cried Mr. Squeers, gradually coming hand over hand down the umbrella, and only unhooking it when he had got tight hold of the victim's collar. "Here's a delicious go! Wackford, me boy, call up one of the coaches." "A coach, father?" cried little Wackford. "Aye, a coach," replied Squeers, feasting his eyes upon the countenance of Smike. "Damn the expense! Let him have a coach." "What's he been doing of?" asked a labourer with a hod of bricks, against whom a fellow labourer Mr. Squeers had backed on the first jerk of the umbrella. "Everything," replied Mr. Squeers, looking fixedly at his old pupil in a sort of venomous, rapturous trance. "Everything. Running away, joining in bloodthirsty attacks upon his master. There's nothing bad that he hasn't done. Oh, what a delicious go this is! Oh, good Lord!" The man looked from Squeers to Smike, but with such mental faculties as the poor fellow possessed had utterly deserted him. The coach came up. Master Wackford entered. Squeers pushed in his prize, and following close at his heels, pulled up the glasses. The coachman mounted his box and drove off slowly, leaving the two bricklayers and an old apple woman and a town-made little boy returning from evening school, who had been the only witnesses of the scene, to meditate upon their leisure. Mr. Squeers sat himself down on the opposite seat to the unfortunate Smike, and planting his hands firmly on his knees, looked at him for some 5 minutes, when, seeming to recover from his trance, he uttered a loud laugh, and slapped his old pupil's face several times, taking the right and the left alternately. "It's a dream," said Squeers. "There's real flesh and blood. I can feel it." And being quite assured of his good fortune by the experiments, Mr. Squeers administered a few boxes on the ear, lest the entertainment should seem to partake of the sameness, and laughed louder and longer at every strike. "Your mother will be fit to jump out of her skin, my boy, when she hears of this," said Squeers to his son. "Oh, won't she, father?" replied Master Wackford. "To think," said Squeers, "that you and me should turn out of a street and come upon him at that very nick, and that I should hold him tight, and only one cast of the umbrella as I hacked him with a grappling iron, as you might say." "Didn't I catch hold of his leg, father?" said little Wackford. You did like a good 'un, my boy," said Mr. Squeers, patting his son's head, "and you shall have the best button-over jacket and waistcoat the next new boy brings down as a reward of merit. Mind that. You always keep on in the same path and do the things that you see your father do, that when you die you'll go straight slap to heaven and no questions asked." Improving the occasion in these words, Mr. Squeers patted his son's head again, and then patted Smike's, but harder, and inquired in a bantering tone how he found himself by this time. I must go home," replied Smike, looking wildly round. "To be sure you must, you're right there," replied Mr. Squeers. "You'll go home very soon, you will. You'll find yourself at the peaceful village of Dotheboys in Yorkshire in something under a week's time, my young friend, and the next time you get away from there I give you leave to keep away. Where's the clothes you run off in, you ungrateful robber?" said Mr. Squeers in a severe voice. Smike glanced at the neat attire which the care of Nicholas had provided for him, and wrung his hands. "Do you know that I could hang you up outside the Old Bailey for making away with them articles of property?" said Squeers. "Do you know that it's a hanging matter? And I ain't quite certain whether or not it's an anatomy matter as well, besides, to walk off with upwards of the value of £5 from a dwelling-house. Eh? Do you know that? What do you suppose was worth of them clothes you had? Do you know that Wellington boot you wore cost 18 and 20 shillings when it was a pair, and the shoe 7 and 6? But you came to the right shop for mercy when you came to me, and thank your stars that it is me who has got you to serve you with the article." Anybody not in Mr. Squeers' confidence would have supposed that he was quite out of the article in question, instead of having a huge stock on hand ready for all comers. Nor would the opinion of sceptical persons have undergone much alteration when he followed up the remark by poking Smike in the chest with the ferrule of his umbrella, and dealing a smart shower of blows with the ribs of the same instrument upon his head and shoulders. "I never thrashed a boy in a hackney coach before," said Mr. Squeers, when he stopped to rest. "There's inconveniency in it, but the novelty gives it a sort of relish too." Poor Smike! He warded off the blows as well as he could, and now shrunk into a corner of the coach, with his head resting on his hands and his elbows on his knees. He was stunned and stupefied, and had no more idea of any act of his which would enable him to escape from the all-powerful Squeers, now that he had no friend to speak or advise with, than he had of all the weary years of his Yorkshire life which preceded the arrival of Nicholas. The journey seemed endless. Street after street was entered and left behind, and still they were jolting on. At last Mr. Squeers began to thrust his head out of the window every half-minute, and to bawl a variety of directions to the coachman, and after passing with some difficulty through several mean streets, when the appearance of the houses and the bad state of the road denoted they had been recently built, Mr. Squeers suddenly tugged at the check-string with all his might, and cried, "Stop!"
"Here, what are you pulling a man's arm off for?" said the coachman, looking angrily round.
"That's the house," replied Squeers. "The second of the 4 little houses, 1 story high, with the green shutters. There's a brass plate on the door, with the name of Snawley."
"Well, couldn't you have said that without wrenching a man's limbs off his body?" inquired the coachman.
"No," bawled Mr. Squeers. "Say another word, and I'll summons you for broken the window. Stop! Stop!" Obedient to this direction, the coach stopped at Mr. Snawley's door. Mr. Snawley, it may be remembered, was the sleek and sanctified gentleman who confided 2 sons, that is, in law, to the parental care of Mr. Squeers, as narrated in the 4th chapter of this history. Mr. Snawley's house was on the extreme borders of some new settlements adjoining Somerstown, and Mr. Squeers had taken lodging therein for a short time, as his stay was longer than usual, and as the Saracen, having experience of Master Wackford's appetite, had declined to receive him on any other terms than as a full-grown customer. "Here we are," said Squeers, hurrying Smike into the little parlour where Mr. Snawley and his wife were taking a lobster supper. "Here's the vagrant, the felon, the rebel, the monster of unthankfulness."
"What, the boy that ran away?" cried Snawley, resting his knife and fork upright upon the table and opening his eyes very wide.
"The very boy," said Squeers, putting his fist close to Smike's nose and drawing it away again, and repeating the process several times with a vicious aspect. "If there wasn't a lady present, I'd fetch him such a— Never mind, I'll owe it him." And here Mr. Squeers related how and in what manner and when and where he had picked up the runaway.
"It is clear that there has been a providence in it, sir," said Mr. Snawley, casting down his eyes with an air of humility, and elevating his fork with a bit of lobster on top of it towards the ceiling.
"Providence is right again, no doubt," replied Mr. Squeers, scratching his nose. "Of course that was to be expected. Any one might have known that."
"Hard-heartedness and evil-doing will never prosper, sir,
said Mr. Snawley. Never was such a thing known, rejoined Squeers, taking a little roll of notes from his pocket-book to see if they were all safe. I have been, Mrs. Snawley, said Mr. Squeers, when he satisfied himself upon this point. I have been that chap's benefactor, feeder, teacher, and clother. I have been that chap's classical, commercial, mathematical, philosophical, and trigonomical friend. My son, my only son, Wackford, has been his brother. Mrs. Squeers has been his mother, his grandmother, and his aunt. And I must say, his uncle too, all in one. She never cottoned to anybody except them two engaging and delightful boys of yours, as she cottoned to this chap. And what's my return? What's come of my milk of human kindness? It's turned to curds and whey when I look at him. Well, it may, sir, said Mrs. Snawley. Oh, well, it may.
Where has he been living all this time? Inquired Snawley. Has he been living with...
Ah, sir, interposed Squeers, confronting him again. Have you been a-living with that devilish Nickleby? But no threats or cuffs could elicit from Smike one word of reply to that question, for he had internally resolved that he would rather perish in the wretched prison that he was about again to answer than utter one syllable which could involve his first and truest friend. He had already called to mind the strict injunctions of secrecy as to his past life which Nicholas had laid upon him when they travelled from Yorkshire, and a confused and perplexed idea of his benefactor might have committed some terrible crime in bringing him away which would render him liable to heavy punishment if detected, had contributed in some degree to reduce him to his present state of apathy and terror. Such were the thoughts, if to visions so imperfect and undefined as those which wandered through his enfeebled brain the term can be applied, which were present to the mind of Smike, and rendered him deaf alike to all intimidation and persuasion. Finding every effort useless, Mr. Squeers conducted him to a little back room upstairs where he was to pass the night, taking the precaution of removing his shoes and coat and waistcoat, and also of locking the door on the outside, lest he should muster up sufficient energy to make an attempt to escape. That worthy gentleman left him to his meditations. What those meditations were, and how the poor creature's heart sank within him when he thought, when he did for a moment cease to think of his late home, and the dear friends and familiar faces with which it was associated, cannot be told. To prepare the mind for such a heavy sleep, its growth must be stopped by rigour and cruelty and childhood. There must be years of misery and suffering lightened by no ray of hope. The chords of the heart, which beat a quick response to the voice of gentleness and affection, must have rusted and broken down in their secret places, and bear the lingering echo of no old word of love and kindness. Gloomy, indeed, must have been the short day and the dull, long, long twilight preceding such a night of intellect as his. There were voices which would have roused him even then, but their welcome tones couldn't penetrate there, and he crept to bed the same listless, hopeless, blighted creature that Nicholas had first found at the Yorkshire school.